It's November 16th. It's a nice sunny day here, very little wind, temperature of 34 degrees. And we're at the home of Shirlee Madow. And she's going to visit today with us regarding her activities as well as her husband, Arnie. And our videographer is Julie Fox, and I am Dr. Roy Anderson. And you want to talk about your activities first, Shirley?
Whatever sequence you want. That's why I'm here, I guess, because of the activities and the very nice award that I got. Sorry. Which I feel should have gone to many, many other people that do more things along that line. Mm-hmm. My volunteer activities have been always from the time I was in high school or junior high. Things that had to do with government, that's my main interest, always was. I was the crazy kid that liked civics. The rest of my friends, of course, thought I was nuts. Mm-hmm. And so I've served on many boards and commissions in Faribault since we've been here. And as did Arn. Arn was on the Planning Commission, and then he was on the airport board for so long, and people used to say to him, Arnie, why are you on the airport board? You're not a pilot. He said, well, somebody has to keep their feet on the ground, and that's me. And my first board that I was on, not counting Girl Scout boards, was the Recreation Board back then. Mm-hmm. And worked with a lot of people. Gary Kinseth was on at that time, and Len Plotnick. Mm-hmm. Got to know him really well. And then eventually I was on the HRA, Housing and Reconstruction, and I was on that for a long, long time. And
what were some of the highlights of that activity?
Well, one of the big highlights actually was building Trails Edge, which was the first market rate apartments built in Faribault. That had been done in several other cities that had HRAs. And because the builders here were not enthusiastic about building market rate apartments. The only ones that were here, aside from maybe a couple in houses they had that people rented out, an apartment, mm-hmm. was what's the one that Cashin owns down in the southwest?
Four Seasons.
Yeah, Four Seasons. That was the first market rate apartments. Mm-hmm. And so people, when they would come to town, would be renting in Northfield because there weren't any apartments here. Well, then we found out that several towns were able to build market rate apartments, and that HUD approved of, even though they were market rate, and we could do that. So that's what we did. And then we had complaints from the builders in town because, you're taking the bread out of our mouths. Well, why didn't you build? Well, after we built Trails Edge, which of course was very popular, and they still have a waiting list there. Mm-hmm. And I did insist that there be underground parking and that there were laundry facilities in the apartments. Mm-hmm. That was my take on it, and that's what they ended up doing. And so anyway, as I say, it was very popular, and that encouraged, when they saw how many people we had renting and that we had actually a waiting list, and still do, then they started building apartments, other places, big apartment areas. So anyway, that was the beginning. And then while I was on HRA is when they started having economic development commissions in various towns. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we did in Faribault, and we had a representative on that board, on that commission from HRA, and I was that representative on the EDA. And then two people from the city council, one or two, I don't remember exactly now. And then one, I think, from maybe the planning commission. And that made up the board. And at that time, Gary Demrow and Gary Kinseth were on that board. And anyway, so I was on that for many, many, many years. And I served as chairman for many years on both of those boards.
What was the thrust of the EDA?
The EDA was providing sometimes help to get businesses into town. We had money available through grants and money that actually went to the EDA at that time from various, like state, and then there was government money. So that's one reason that and the fact that and helping people to stay in town as far as businesses, and that's what they still do. They're very active along that line when they have money or partially help in some way. In fact, they represented the city, of course. So that was my long time term, and then I've always been very active in chamber, both because Arn, of course, was a member because of the state hospital. And
I saw you had a chamber function here last week.
I've been at every chamber function.
He was at Roosevelt School.
Yeah. I've been to as many as I can get to. Sometimes, if you're so tied up or you're out of town. Otherwise, I'm there. And I served on several boards. And the one that I'm still on is it used to be called the Education Board, which was made up of business people and volunteers and representatives from the chamber. It's a chamber board, and that certainly works to help get new businesses in town or helping them with other activities and so forth. And then I was also a chamber volunteer ambassador for a lot of years. I guess when I was a teenager, I was pretty shy. Well, not with my friends, but I know what it's like to come in someplace and you don't really know people.
And so you mentioned Girl Scouts. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Well, because there's no way that I wanted to work with like Girl Scout troops, work with them. So I was always on the administrative Girl Scout board, and I did that for a lot of years till the kids were out of Scouts. But I was on that board when we decided to get rid of the property that we had inherited on Circle Lake. I think it's Circle Lake. Cedar Lake.
West Cedar.
Cedar, right, where Steversons used to live. Is that Cedar or Circle? Cedar, I guess.
Yeah.
And so, because a lot of us were connected to the Rotary and that our husbands or whatever belonged to Rotary at that time, that we decided to let Rotary manage it from then on. Because we didn't have the ability to look after it and that kind of thing. So they've done it ever since. And every once in a while they remember to give us credit for handing it over to them. And it's still used quite a bit for campouts and...
Even weddings. I think they've had weddings there. And I camped out there with Scouts, I know, during the winter one time.
Yeah.
And
we used to have scout troops that came up from like Iowa and so forth that would...
Now they'd go to the Boundary Waters canoe area and then they'd stop here, come back and go in.
On the way. And,
Richard Peavy digging the privy out there. That was quite a thing of the Security National Bank.
Yeah. Well, he was something. And then there was, it was Dick Peavy at that time, because he was a real good friend. In fact, when we bought our first house, I'll tell you this much because I think people know, that we had rented, when we first came to Faribault.
Excuse me, when would that have been, Shirley?
Huh?
In the late 50s?
Early 50s.
Early 50s.
Is when we came. Believe it or not, Doug was 4 months old.
Okay.
Arn had applied to the position. We were in Worcester, Massachusetts at the time. He did his graduate work in Bloomington, Indiana University, where Skinner was and everybody
B.F.
else.
Skinner.
Yeah, was head of the department. In fact, they were our backyard neighbors.
Oh, is that
We were
so?
renting a house in Bloomington and lived up on like the 3rd floor. And it was definitely like student housing, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, so and then we did, remember Kennedy's, George Kennedy, who was the medical director there, so he would have been Arn's superior.
Mm-hmm.
And Marguerite, his wife, who was very active in Girl Scouts and kind of took us under her wing. So she found a house that we could rent for a year,
Mm-hmm.
which was in the Northwest someplace. I think it was maybe Lincoln Avenue, I'm not real sure, but it was definitely in the Northwest.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were there for about a year, and then the people that had rented us the house decided to get back together. They had taken a year off from their relationship, their marriage,
Uh-huh.
and then got back together. So then we had to find more housing. And Marguerite, again, came to our rescue and knew that Ida Sparks, that was Milt Umbright's mother-in-law, was renting a place up on the east side, right next to the Allen School. Was an apartment,
Mm-hmm.
two family apartment, and so that's where we ended up living for about 5 years, renting there, and got to know Faye and Dina very well, and then Ganya's down the block, and I always remember.
You like the east side?
Oh yeah, we were on the east side forever until I sold the house. And it was... So anyway, when we were looking for a rental space, we had spent about 6 weeks at the state hospital. There was an apartment upstairs from the administration building.
Oh.
So we had Lynn, and Doug was in a drawer at that time till our furniture came. And then we ended up living in that rental place, but that because of Marguerite. But otherwise, when we were looking for rental space, we found out in a hurry that semi-modern meant there was a sink in the kitchen with water, but there was an outhouse in town, believe it or not. Well, this was in the 50s, so there were still a lot of out. So of course that didn't appeal to us because Arn was a Brooklynite, born and bred and grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and St. Louis was a lot more modern than. I never knew what an outhouse was. So anyway, we finally, thanks to Marguerite, we found this apartment that Ida Sparks was moving out to the lake. So anyway, we lived there until when my dad died about 5 years later.
Mm-hmm.
My mother split the insurance money between the three of us, so then we had a down payment.
Oh, okay.
And we finally had a car, after he got a few, because we didn't have a car for the first year that we lived in Faribault. And anyway, so that's that story. We finally found our house, and he dragged everybody in there to make sure that it was a good buy. So I've been a volunteer since I was a kid. I was even in grade school, because I was in an 8th grade grammar school in St. Louis. And when the teachers had a meeting, in my class, which was probably 7th grade, up to 8th grade was part of the high school. It was for 8th, 9th, 10th, well, maybe it was 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th. So 8th grade, 7th and 8th grade. I would be put in charge of the class, of my classmates. Or they'd not of my classmates, but of the younger kids. So I would be the substitute teacher down while they had their meeting. And I remember one time I was telling them to keep them quiet, because they were like first and second graders. And back in those days, they weren't allowed to walk around, even in kindergarten very much. So I was telling them this mystery story that I was making up as I went around, and they were listening so well that when the teacher came in, she was in the back of the class, and she said, "Just continue." And so she was doing some paperwork while I was telling them this mystery story. So that was one of my first volunteer things. I was always teacher's pet back in those days. Mm-hmm. And then in high school, I certainly got to do a lot of volunteer things. Mm-hmm. I did volunteer work at the library. Whatever I could do that was volunteer, I was into that kind of thing. And still pretty shy with, except for my own friends, until I got to be a senior. And a friend and I, we were on the staff of the high school newspaper. Mm-hmm. And you got credit, like English credit, for taking that class. And she and I were co-editors of what we would call today the gossips page, or the gossip column. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you can't believe how popular that made us, because everybody wanted to get their name in there. So when we'd come in the morning to school, and everybody, before the school bell rang, we'd all be in the halls visiting and so forth, and we had all these people that would come up and say, "So this is what we did last week, can you get that into your column?" So I became more outgoing because, it was easy. I didn't have to work at it.
Sure.
So anyway, after I met Arn, and I had been admitted to School of Nursing after I graduated from high school, and I had about a year to wait. I had been accepted, but I had to wait till the next class, which was the following year.
Is that in St. Louis?
In St. Louis, yes. Mm-hmm. And toward the end of that time, about 6 weeks before, is when I met Arn, and he was in the service at that time. He had already graduated from college at the age of 19.
I see.
And then, and that was in New York City. It was Townsend. Well, Townsend Harris was the secondary. It was the junior high, city junior high, and I've forgotten the name of City College, I guess it was, is where he got his undergraduate degree. Mm-hmm. And then he went into the Army. It was toward the end of the war. And that's when I met him. There was a USO party at the local Y, and I had gone to meet a friend. Anyway, that's how we met. And when we went together, he was at Scott Field. He was in the Army Air Corps back in those days, before it was the Air Force. Mm-hmm. And he was sent down to Texas. He was a radio person, and which was diddity-da-da back in those days. They did not have talk radio on those planes. And so he was in Texas, and we rode back and forth every night, every day, both of us. Mm-hmm. And eventually he was sent back to Scott Field. And then he was there for a year and a half, until when the war ended, he was sent to Okinawa to relieve some of the guys that were had been over there for so long. So that's how we met, and I guess we went together for about 3 years total. Really? Wow. And I didn't want to get married until I graduated from nursing school. I wanted to make sure I had that mm-hmm. in me, the RN, sure. Registered nurse. So anyway, that's how we met, and eventually we were married when he was in graduate school. Mm-hmm. And I was at Indiana University with him for a year or two. And then when he finished everything, he was a doctoral candidate. We were in Worcester, Massachusetts for a year where he did his internship, I guess you'd say.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually, when that year was up, and that was thanks to the GI Bill that he was able to go to school.
That was
And he
substantial.
always,
wasn't
he
it?
always worked for one of the professors, ran the rats or whatever else that he had to do, and babysat. We'd babysit with their kids, and then he had applied to Minnesota because Minnesota had a very good reputation back in those days on mental health problems and those kind of things. But he never heard from Minnesota, so we had to take a job. So we were in Columbus, Ohio for a year, and that's where Doug was born. I did remember one time when we were in chamber, when I was at a chamber meeting, and Laurie or whoever it was, as a get together, to get to know each other. She said, "We're going to do this little exercise where you tell something that nobody else knows about you." And it dawned on me that all 5 of us were born in different states. Arn was born in New York. I was born in Missouri. Lynn was born in Bloomington, Indiana. Doug was born in Columbus, Ohio. And Eric was born in Minnesota. And I hadn't even thought about it till then. So anyway, he finally heard from Minnesota, and he came and liked what he saw and talked to people. Dr. Engberg at that time was head of the institution, and George Kennedy was head of the medical staff. Brule came just the same time as we did, and they became very, very close friends. And that's where my kids grew up, pretty much. Went to Washington School before it was Roosevelt School, and it's still in existence,
Sure.
but not as a school, as recreation department.
How did you get into the WCAL?
That's what you started asking about. Well, as I got older, or as my kids grew up and I had more time available, I think by the time I got involved, we had met Paul Peterson. We were very close friends with Lloyd and Sally Hansen because of the music, backgrounds of both of us. And so at one point they introduced us to Paul Peterson, who was the manager at WCAL and was a classmate of Lloyd's. So they'd been very close friends, and he still sees them. And so that's how we met. And then Paul at one time asked if I would be interested in being on their advisory staff, committee, I guess it would be. So yes, I thought, well, that'll be interesting. And I remember at that first meeting, we all went around and introduced ourselves and the connection, and I was the only one from Faribault, but there were other people from Northfield and from the cities that were on their board. And anyway, so then I helped with the volunteer things, the calls, for money raising. And otherwise, they were very short back in those days. They didn't get a whole lot of support from the state or from the federal government. And of course, they were a nonprofit. When we first came, in fact, WCAL and KUOM, or not KUOM, whatever the university station is or was, shared one 90, whatever it was on the dial.
I see.
WCAL was on from 6 o'clock in the morning when they played the every day. To start the day, they played a sort of a march, and then the rest of the time was classical music till about 10:30. and then it switched over to the university station. So they shared that, what do you call it?
Band.
Yeah. And then eventually, by the time I was involved, of course, they had enlarged the FM stations, and WCL had their own station, and KUOM never did have anything except a campus station. I think they still do just have a campus station. And WCL at the beginning was AM, and then it became FM. And so Paul had asked me to be on their advisory board where I was, and became very, very good friends, and I would be there one morning a week. And I got where they really needed me, to answer the phone and to do whatever kind of errands needed doing, because they were very short of staff back then. They had a couple of students that were there besides the paid staff. And Paul Peterson was the manager for lots of years. So anyway, I stayed there forever. And by the time I left, when they sold the station to Bill Kling at, NPR, which nobody was happy about, but in fact, well, that was interesting. A lot of alums were unhappy with the fact that they sold the station to him. He's was not a popular person.
I see.
And so anyway, so I was there like one morning a week forever. I had more seniority than only one other person. Everybody else had gone on from then. It was no longer. There were only a couple of people that were left, and then eventually, of course, after he bought it, it was kind of became NPR. They did run that one. What do they call it? Living with Faith or whatever. It was one program where they played mostly religious music. That was the only one. It was sort of modern religion.
I see.
And otherwise, it's totally, my daughter still won't tune into 89.3 because it's the current now. No way. I don't. The time I listen, I always listen to NPR because I like the news, and I love when I hear like the people that used to work for the station are now working there, much as they hate it. But when you got a mortgage to pay and kids to put into college, you don't have any choice. A job is a job. So I do listen when Steve Sarek is on, who's on frequently, and Bill Morlock that does the afternoon traffic time, and so I still see like Michael Adams, who was an announcer there for a long time, and he plays the viola in the symphony, and his wife Daria is in the St. Paul Chamber. Yeah, so a lot of times, especially when Arn was still alive, or if I go with Lynn and Tim to a concert, I contact Michael, and we meet afterwards for a glass of wine or something, So I still have that, and I see Sarah Entenman frequently. And I told you her husband was head of the Oriental Studies when we went to China, but he took us on a lot of side trips after everybody else was in bed.
I see.
Yeah.
You and Arn had a lot of friends, didn't you?
Yeah. Pretty much.
How about Arn's activities? Could you touch on some of those?
Well, I did touch on some of them. I said, of course he was very involved with professional organizations, and he was chairman of this, that, and the other, and had to fly off here, there, and other places, in the annual meetings, and otherwise he was active in town as soon as he could be, of course active in Rotary, and then was on the Planning Commission for a long time, and then was on the airport board, and he was still on the airport board when he died.
Okay,
in fact,
Rice County Historical Society, I know he had
oh
a
yeah,
special
oh
project.
very
What was
well.
that
After
project?
he retired, he quit because he was assistant CEO. He had come there as chief of the psychology department. But eventually evolved into becoming assistant CEO. And in fact, Charlie Turnbull was CEO at that time, and when they were starting to think about closing the institution or converting it, whatever, he and Charlie spent a lot of time at the legislature trying to talk them into donating the farmland. You know, that, remember, they did all their own farming, dairying, and everything. When we came, the census was 3,200, which was the largest institution in the state. Now I think it's the largest prisons in the state.
Yes.
And so anyway, and the thing is that as assistant CEO, Arn was the one that had to deal with federal rules, state rules, the court was involved, the parents were involved, and this went on forever when they were trying to close the place. And he finally said, I'm going to quit because I can't take this anymore. You know, it was such stress and so much to be concerned about that he finally did quit. He said, I don't care if I'm not ready for Social Security. I quit. And so then he was happy. I still worked very part-time as an RN. I never worked full-time. And it wasn't until my youngest was probably in sixth grade, I guess, that I started working one day a week. They were so short of RNs. So anyway, so Arn was very happy, doing the crossword puzzle every day, listening to classical music, reading all the books
That he hadn't had time for.
Not only that, but he had too much time, I thought. Because I didn't like him, I didn't want him to be doing housework except maybe throwing stuff into the washing machine. Because I only worked one day a week, and I don't want him to become a house husband. So anyway, at the one historical dinner, they were talking about the fact that they needed some volunteer help, and I go, ooh, I think I know just the person. So anyway, so he started helping out there, and then he did all the genealogical studies. He loved digging for facts, and so pretty soon he knew people would write in and say, I think my great-great-grandfather lived in Rice County or lived in Faribault. Maybe he was a doctor, or maybe he had a store, they weren't sure. So he would do all the research. He knew every church secretary. He knew every cemetery manager. And then John, what's his name, that did all the cemeteries?
John Dalby?
Yeah, then John Dalby was a big help because he already had, by that time, was not able to do anything except that kind of stuff. It was heart problems.
Sure.
So anyway, so he did that, and he just loved it. Every morning he would go to the to the Rice County Museum, which was the head of where the offices are for the Rice County Historical Society. And he loved doing that stuff. He loved digging for facts. And then he would send all the material to whichever family wanted to know, and then would send a donation to the society.
So that really was a nice activity for him then.
It was wonderful. He loved doing that. He loved it. And, so he did that until he couldn't do it anymore. He was ill for 7 weeks, and he had a wonderful philosophy. I just remember when he was getting radiation treatment just for pain. I mean, there was nothing to do with he had bone cancer that they discovered when they took x-rays. Actually, it was Laney that really found out what was really wrong with him. That's what the pain was caused by, and it was already way advanced. And it's not like bone marrow, it's in the bone, and that goes really fast. So I just remember that we had to have his blood tested before he'd go up for radiation therapy from home. And I remember Brant Merrill, who was a friend and his doctor, came in and he said, gee, Arnie, how are you doing? He said, you can tell me. If it were me, I'd be so, can I say pissed off? You can edit that out if you want. But that's actually what he said, Brant. And he said, I'd be so scared and I'd be mad. And Arn said, Brant, that's you. It's not me. You're born, you live, and you die. It's going to happen to everyone. And years later, when Brant is my internist also, except he just retired, he said, Arnie sure taught me a lesson when he said, you're born, you live, and you die. Yeah, oh yeah, that's going to happen to everyone.
Well, how about you, Shirley? What kind of philosophies of life would you have that you could
philosophy,
live with us? Or?
Philosophy of life, sort of the same as what he had. I've always been a volunteer, and I've always been, I think, a good friend. It seems like my best friends have moved far away. In fact, Joan Hagman, do you remember Hagman?
Yes,
John?
yes.
Well, they've been very close our whole lives. And in fact, she called yesterday because she knew I had that doctor's appointment last week, and it was a big mix-up about the time and everything, but I had arranged to meet her for lunch. And so I did meet her for lunch, and I was telling her the whole story about the doctor not being there and the screw-up on the appointments. And I said, but we made another appointment for Thursday. This was on Tuesday, and the following Thursday is when I finally saw that doctor, and this was at Sister Kenny. And so I had told her that this was going to be happening. Well, last night I got a phone call, and it was Joan, and she said, so Cheryl, how are you doing, and what did the doctor finally say? Because she was afraid it was something really awful.
I see.
So I just told her that everything was okay. And so I also talked yesterday, just before Joan called, do you remember Howard Miller? That was when they were building the new high school, they hired John to be principal of the high school, and then the junior high would be separate. Before when we came, they were both together.
Right.
And Howard Miller was the principal of the junior high.
Okay.
And they lived right down the block from us, June and Howard. So we've been very close friends ever since, and wherever they've been, and Howard died last year, but June, they've lived in Chesterfield, which is I'd say a suburb of St. Louis, but St. Louis doesn't have suburbs. St. Louis and Kansas City are individual, independent government units. They're not part of any counties. So St. Louis County has nothing to do with St. Louis, the city. And it's one reason that St. Louis has never expanded. It was like 700,000 when I was a kid, and that's what it still is today.
Really?
Yeah, except that they have, the inner city is all business buildings, and they have condominiums like they have here. So anyway,
Quite a historic city.
yeah, very. And I remember always being aware of the history of St. Louis, which I was always a history buff also, and I was very proud of the fact that St. Louis was gateway to the West. And besides, I was born on Jefferson's birthday, so this was April the 13th. If everybody wants to know, you can wish me a happy birthday. And so anyway, I've always loved history also, and that was something that Arn and I had in common, that and music. I love every kind of music. He liked classical music and show tunes growing up in New York. Until when Doug started playing piano when he was like 2 years old, picking things out on the piano when we got it. No kidding. The trumpet voluntary was the first thing. I came up from putting laundry in down in the basement. That was when we were in the rental place. And we had this big upright, actually. And we knew that he had perfect pitch, both boys did, because when they would repeat anything. You know how kids repeat sounds? It was writing right there. And here he had picked out, honest to God, the trumpet voluntary and the piano. So anyway, and he did that. And pretty soon he was playing by ear everything when he was 3 years old. And then Arn said, this kid has to be able to play Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. He's got to take lessons. So he had to take lessons for a lot of years. Wasn't very happy at the beginning, but all 3 kids did. But he took
I heard him last week at
yeah,
Children's
well,
Celebration.
yeah, and the thing is that he was glad in future years. They took lessons from Marie Jensen in Northfield. She was on maternity leave when we first got her because they had taken lessons here for a year, and both he and Lynn were way ahead of Mrs. What's her name that was the piano teacher that was the only one in town. Mm-hmm. And so they were with Marie. And then Paul Jensen, her husband, was very involved in in Riverbend. He was on the board. He was a professor of some kind of science at Carleton. Something to do with, I don't know, geology or whatever. But he was very instrumental in getting Riverbend started.
Yeah, I know him.
Yeah, I'm sure you do, because he was up until recently. They're both at the retirement center now, and she's in a wheelchair. And when I talked to her the other day, because she always asks about the kids. In fact, I was telling Lynn that she said, when I was talking to her, she said, your kids were the best students I ever had.
Wow.
Well, they were, whatever. But we drove over to Northfield a lot of time, years, until they could drive themselves, and all 3 of them. So anyway, and he had broken his foot or something and was right now recuperating in a nursing home, in a hospital. And they weren't very, she said he's not very happy about it. Well, I guess not.
Yeah.
But I think he's been active, as long as he could be.
About the award and how you were notified.
I was shocked.
Yes.
And it's, service to mankind, and I don't think that, I feel that a lot of people do more things to service mankind unless you can, think of Trail's Edge and stuff. Well, maybe that was kind of that kind. I've always done volunteer work, but it's stuff that I'm interested in, like government things and some non-profits, like the Paradise. I've been very active with the Paradise. And with the Art Center, in fact, when we came to town, and when we moved into our apartment, that apartment next to the Allen School, eventually our neighbors upstairs were Van Gilders. Do you remember Norm Van Gilder?
I remember the name.
He was the first, what should I say, salesman for the newspaper. I don't know what and I remember whenever we would move any place, my mother would ask for write to the city and get the newspaper, and she was just overwhelmed with the idea that the whole newspaper, the Daily News, was 2 folded pages, 1, 2, 3, 4. And she didn't think very much of that, but she was impressed with the fact that Faribault was 50 miles from Mayo and 50 miles especially Mayo, and 50 miles from the Twin Cities.
Right.
When my cousin, my mother was from England, from London, and I had a cousin there that was just 11 years younger than my mother. And when he finally came to this country after his first wife died, he came to visit us, and that was the first time. We had already met him when we went to England the first time, and my daughter met him even before because she went to school. Lawrence had classes through Lawrence in Germany, and on spring break she went to London and met him. Well, anyway, when he came to Faribault, several years later, lots of years later, the 2 things he wanted to see, his favorite book growing up in England was Huckleberry Finn. So he wanted to see the Mississippi River, and he
Yes.
wanted to see Mayo, because a lot of his English friends had been to Mayo for medical reasons. So that's what we did. I went in with the car with him, went along the river, and we sat there, and there were barges going by. He was overwhelmed, thrilled to actually see where Huckleberry Finn. And you know, we know that it's the best novel, or many of us agree, including all the experts, the best American novel. But to hear somebody from England say that that's his favorite, well, he was educated. So I thought that
That's a
was
good
wonderful.
point.
And then we went down to Mayo from Lake City,
Oh, sure.
and he was very pleased.